coming to my class with life experiences, with lived experiences, what we would call tacit knowledge, right? This is the Michael Polanyi's I know more than I can tell. On maybe the furthest edge is the college degree, either end of the ladder, if you will. But in between, there's a lot of opportunity. And that's what I'm trying to build into my class with what I'm calling these badges or micro-credentials. Some people call them certificates or competencies, but they're more validated. It's now an independent third party, in this case, me, a faculty, somebody with deep expertise in strategy and leadership and executive education, saying that, all right, you've gone through a 2-week communication assessment. You've gone through a 2-week problem-solving assessment. You've gone through a 2-week teamwork assessment. You've gone through a 2-week storytelling assessment.
Welcome to the show, Dr. Bruce Rudy. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Yes. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah. So I am an associate professor of strategy in the Alvarez College of Business at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I've been there since 2011. My area of research are non-market strategy and more recently, leadership and executive education, helping our students, learn the skills they need to be successful in the workplace. During my time at UTSA, I have also been the executive director for our executive education programs from 2017 to 21. And that would be both our executive MBA program and a lot of executive education programming we do with leaders and businesses in and around San Antonio. And I guess I should also share that I'm not your typical academic. I worked in industry for about a decade before I returned for my PhD. And I did my PhD just up the road at the University of Texas at Austin. So I certainly care about the research and love doing that aspect of my job, but I also very much enjoy the teaching and helping our students figure out how to develop their careers.
And I'm so excited to talk to you because that perspective as an executive leadership program director, your experience teaching management courses is perfect for the topic of the day, which is how we can help our students get jobs in such a tight labor market. It's tough out there with AI and all these other things. So at the top of your list, what is your advice for those who are seeking a job in a tight labor?
It's not a simple piece of advice, and I would say argue that it's sometimes difficult to execute, and it's experience. Really, at the end of the day, what our students need, what any student needs, is experience beyond the classroom. And so to the extent that we can provide that in our courses at the university, wonderful. But in this day and age, as you mentioned, Ryan, with all the pressure from AI, from the uncertainty in the labor market, our students, any student looking to get a job, they need to have experience. And so any type of experience, anything that they can demonstrate that they've been out there, they've done the work, they've been in difficult situations where they've had to, have a hard conversation with somebody, they have the communication skills, they have those experiences. That's, I think, ultimately the difference between getting a job and not getting a job in this type of market.
So experience, tell us more about that because I know that in a tight labor market, sometimes that bottom rung is disappearing with internships drying up, with entry level positions even drying up. So how can one get that experience whenever there's less opportunity than usual?
This is the $1,000,000 question, Ryan. I mean, if we could figure this out, we could solve a lot of problems. And I think, so in my course, what I try to help my students see is that when I'm teaching them strategy, right, I'm teaching them what we would consider like explicit knowledge, the strategy frameworks. How do you do an analysis in a competitive environment? How do you do a value chain of the internal environment within the firm? Right? These are explicit frameworks. This is content knowledge that somebody as a strategy professor can teach. But as my thinking has evolved in this space, what I've come to recognize is that our students, they actually come to the classroom with a tremendous amount of experience. That experience, these now, granted, I'm teaching students that are 22 to 24 years old. They tend to be graduating in the semester that I'm teaching them, but they're coming to my class with life experiences, with lived experiences, what we would call tacit knowledge, right? This is the, Michael Polanyi's I know more than I can tell concept, right? The explicit knowledge is this is what I know. I just took Bruce's strategy class. I can do a Porter's Five Forces. But the tacit knowledge is, hey, I was in this volunteer activity and I had to collaborate with this team. I had to engage some folks that weren't really invested, and I was able to motivate them. I was able to encourage them, and we got the job done. That's experience. We can do more with our students by helping them see that. And that's in fact what I'm trying to do in my course this semester with a set of what I call power skills and credentialing that allows us to assess our students, allows me to assess the students across these various, what I would call soft skills. So for me, it's communication, it's problem solving, it's teamwork, and it's a skill I call storytelling. It's the ability to tell your story, to pitch, to make your pitch. And so that sits on top of my strategy content. And what I'm seeking to do is help my students understand that they actually have a lot of these skills and they have a lot of this experience. We just have to bring it to the forefront. We have to assess it. And as university professors, potentially credential it. And I think that can go a long way to demonstrating the experience that we're talking about. So it's, yes, in a perfect world, right? The student would enter their undergraduate studies um, sometime in either their summer of their sophomore year or the summer of their junior year, they take an internship and they would work for an organization and it would be the job that then would result in them, they would land that job when they graduated. So I did a little survey of my course of my students, 110 students in my two sections of strategy, and only 37% of my students have done internships. The folks that haven't done internships far outnumber the folks that have. And so then if you even look at, again, only my students, so N of 100, 110, not a big sample size, there's also of the 36%, 37% that have done internships, only about 29% of my students have jobs lined up when they graduate. So we have an opportunity to improve the situation significantly. And so the goal then has to be, you know, beyond just doing the traditional, I did my internship, I got my job. We as teachers, we as facilitators have to figure out ways to mine our students' experiences to demonstrate that they actually have a lot of experience. And then we need to figure out how can we assess and validate and communicate that to the job market.
And validation, that's a key word. You have mentioned the idea of credentials and embedding credentials in your courses. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today, because that to me is a wonderful strategy to help our students be more attractive to employers and more attractive to potential clients if they're going out on their own. Can you speak to the importance of the credential ladder and how that works?
Yeah, yeah, great question. So there are, in this world of credentialing and competencies, there is this, like you said, a ladder, right? And so there is a market out there, right, for what we call learning and employment records, LERs. And an LER is this digital, essentially resume that anybody can create. They can populate that digital resume with various credentials and competencies and certificates. Now just like when we make our resumes or CVs, whatever we want to call it, we say, "Oh, I worked at this company and, I did these three things and I have these skills," right? That's us saying that we have those skills. And hopefully those are good enough to get us into an interview where we get to talk to somebody and demonstrate to the recruiter that we actually do possess those skills. But that's self-acknowledgement of those skills. There are other types of credentials, as you mentioned, along this credential ladder on maybe the furthest edge is the college degree. Having for my students a BBA in business, right? That would be a validated credential by the university that says that this student has done their 120 hours of coursework at a satisfactory level and they have received their degree. So that's kind of, either end of the ladder, if you will, right? But in between, there is a lot of opportunity. And that's what I'm trying to build into my class with what I'm calling these badges or micro credentials. Some people call them certificates or competencies, but they're more validated than me just saying, "Hey, I worked at this company, I did these three deals, and as a result, I have this type of experience." It's a step beyond that. It's now an independent third party, in this case, me, a faculty, somebody with deep expertise in strategy and leadership and executive education, saying that, all right, you've gone through a 2-week communication assessment. You've gone through a 2-week problem solving assessment. You've gone through a 2-week teamwork assessment. You've gone through a 2-week storytelling assessment. I assessed you on the front end to see your baseline. I gave you some knowledge and some frameworks to think about how to be a better problem solver, how to be a better collaborator in a team. And I've assessed you in the middle and then at the end. And for me, anyway, I use validated assessments. You know, there's tons of validated assessments. You're a communication professor, you know this, and so I'm not in the business of creating my own assessments. I'm out there saying like, "Look, what's a good framework to use, right, for communication?" Then I'm building the questions and the journey for the students to be able to demonstrate whether they possess that competency. And then in my class, what I'm able to do is evaluate that competency at three different levels and then give them a badge, give them a micro credential that says you're an advanced communicator and you're a proficient communicator, you're a developing communicator. But these badges are far more valuable than me just saying that I'm a good communicator, because now we've got a third party, me, basically validating this through a set of validated assessments. And the way this then works is when an employer looks at this, they say, wait a minute, potential employee X. Yes, you have all these life experiences, and I've seen your resume, and wow, look at the things you've done with your volunteer activity and so on and so forth. And I see that you have your degree, but you also have these specific credentials validated by the university and this professor that has expertise in this space that says that you're an advanced communicator. Golly, I mean, I know as a recruiter, I know that as our company values communication, the ability for folks to have difficult conversations, to be concise, be considerate in their communications, right? Be clear. And you're telling me that this credential's been validated at the highest level by your university? That has value, right? And so this ladder, right, extends from the self-reporting stuff that we all can do currently, the full-on validated degree that any university provides a student that's met the requirements. But then these competencies reside in between those two extremes, and they speak to specific skills. And for me anyway, as a business professor, and someone that's worked in industry for, a good chunk of my life, I believe I understand what the critical skills are, and that's what I've chosen to build into my course and validate and then credential.
Excellent. I can imagine students getting excited about this idea. And I know there's other places they can go for credentials that's in their power to seek, like LinkedIn Learning, like Coursera, and like the Adobe Creative Skills series at UT San Antonio. We offer all of those sorts of things as a part of our agreement with those places. But I know that you're also interested in skill stacking. What is skill stacking? And how does that relate to this idea of these badges and credentials that are validated?
Yeah, that's a great question. So skill stacking is this idea that each individual skill can combine together to create some larger kind of recognition of skills, right? So let's take my course, for example. I think I've mentioned now a couple of times, I've got these four skills that I've built into my course, right? So we've got the students start with communication, then they do a 2 week session on teamwork, then a 2 week session on problem solving, and then it ultimately ends. The last session is a 2 week session on storytelling. We have a culminating experience in my course as well, where the students get to, and it'll happen here in a couple of weeks, where they get to go back and interact with some executive MBA alumni that I've taught over the years that I have been kind enough to volunteer their time. The way that those skills stack together, though, let's hold this career day thing off to the side, is those are all soft skills. These are all skills that we know to be leadership skills. And so, the classic example I like to say is I would walk into my EMBA classroom and I would say to them, in my strategy course, I'd say, okay, let me tell you what a great leader does. A great leader is an awesome communicator. A great leader asks questions. They're curious. They're critical thinkers. They're problem solvers. They're collaborators. All the skills that we know good leaders possess. They're orators. They can motivate. Right? And I'm saying this, and the students are nodding their head, and they're like, "Oh, Professor Rudy, this is going to be great. You're going to make me a good leader, right?" And then I hit him with the punchline, which is, I can't teach you any of that stuff. That's lived experience. All I can tell you and all I can help you with is that there are these frameworks that we use in my field in management that help us think about what it means to be a good communicator or a problem solver, a critical thinker, or asking good questions or having difficult conversations. These are all soft skills that are exceptionally difficult to just teach, right? You have to have lived experiences in these. And so as a result, right, the way that I teach these skills in my course is I have these assessments and I ask them to engage the assessments, not so they understand A, the framework, but then I ask them B, to populate the framework with their lived experiences so they can be reflecting on what they've done. But because all of these skills are what we would call soft skills, or I think the term used more often is power skills. The way that my class works is each student can earn these individual badges for these four skills, but then they stack together in I've created what I call a power skill badge that stacks everything and holds everything together. And what that really represents for students that are able to achieve high enough levels in these other four skills to get the power skill is that now they possess what I would call is like a skeleton key for success in business, right? So being a good communicator, being a problem solver, being a critical thinker, being able to tell your story, right? These are skills that are universal in terms of the need. Every organization needs them for the employees to be successful. And so I call it a skeleton key because you can literally plug these skills, right? Individuals with these skills into any organization and they should be just fine, right? The organization will teach them the critical kind of, explicit knowledge that they need to be successful in that job. But they possess the leadership skills, or at least the foundations of the leadership skills to be able to ask the right questions, to critically assess what they know, right? To work with a team, to be able to pitch their ideas. And so that's kind of how this all fits together, with a stackable credential in my course, right? It would be weird for me to teach, you know, 3 sessions or 3 2-week sessions on soft skills and then throw in like Python coding, right? Or Rust coding, right? You'd be like, Bruce, what are you doing? Like those things aren't related. Like one's a technical skill and one's a leadership soft skill. And so when we stack skills, we want to be really thoughtful about how we put them together. It doesn't mean that, you couldn't have a set of technical skills that were a combination of folks having gone through classes at Coursera or some of the other offerings, Google, where they're getting these validated credentials. Those can tell a different story. This person has a real deep technical knowledge of why, whatever the content is. But it just, as a strategy professor and someone who works a lot with executives, I believe I understand what is needed for these individuals to be successful. And that's why I focused on stackable soft skills or power skills. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and it's music to my ears because this is communication skills and it validates what we're doing. We often, when we're selling our communication degree, we're often selling this idea that employers really want communication skills because in all these surveys for decades, it's been at the top of the list of things employers want, right? The top 10 things are always communication skills. And then the one that's not is takes initiative. And it sounds like what you're doing relates nicely to that too, the taking initiative. I know that this idea of evidence-based portfolios can play a part in this process. And in public relations, when we're teaching public relations or podcasting or AI and personal branding, we're asking them to create these kinds of portfolios that they can show as evidence. And those can complement this idea of the stacking of credentials as well. How does portfolios that are evidence-based play in your strategy for helping students get hired?
Yeah, that's a great question. And before I answer, I will just say that, the communications department in colleges have lived in the shadows for far too long, Brian. It is not just a top 10 skill. Communication is like the number one skill that all organizations want. And I've got nothing other than my intuition to support this, but I believe that those skills become even more critical in the world of AI, where a lot of the analysis and whatnot that's happening in the behind the scenes in our Gen AI programs, whether that's good or bad, there's the critical thinking component to assessing what's being produced. But ultimately, to make decisions, we have to communicate those decisions. And I only see communication skills becoming more critical to our students' success in the future. Okay, get off my soapbox on communication. Let's talk about portfolios. So it's interesting you bring up portfolios because the idea of students creating portfolios is not a new concept, although it is somewhat new in the School of Business, in the College of Business, right? And so I have a son who is a student in an architecture program. All he does is create portfolios, and that's what he uses to get jobs and get projects. As I was thinking about my course and and how to engage my students at a deeper level and bring out these skills, this idea of the ePortfolio kind of originated. And then I spent a lot of time doing research, and trying to understand, well, what could an ePortfolio be for a business student. And that's how I happened upon these learning and employment records, these LERs, which, depending on which state you're in, there are actually job markets built specifically around learning and employment records. But what a learning and employment record is at its foundation is a portfolio. It is an ePortfolio. The transcript, where the university owns the transcript, right? And the student has to buy the transcript. The student owns the LER. And that's their portfolio. And it is most easily to think about this as like a digital resume, but it is a living document. And I'm not saying a resume is not a living document, but this is the kind of thing that grows with every credential that you add to it. The portfolio then, this ePortfolio, this LER, what it does is it allows our students to highlight their skills, right? So they're able to potentially push their skills out into the space, right? Like these are communications. This is my communication badge. This is my problem solving badge. But then in some states, in Colorado, in California, I believe Alabama's got an LER marketplace. There are actual marketplaces in the state where you have to have an LER to participate in that marketplace. And in those marketplaces, what we're seeing is a more refined job search. Organizations are saying, well, yes, I mean, the college degree would be nice, but that's less important to me than somebody who has demonstrated expertise in communication, in problem solving, in um, yeah, I don't know, Python, in a Tableau, right? And so they can actually, instead of sending this kind of generic job position posting out there, they can get really specific with the skills that they want, both technical and non-technical, kind of these power skills that I'm trying to teach. And they can actually pool the students through the marketplace. So we get a much better matching algorithm with these ePortfolios. I have no doubt that this is where it's going. I'm also have no doubt that we're on the bleeding edge of this right now. And my students were excited. They were a little bit like, Professor Rudy, what do you like? What's ePortfolio? Learning and employment record? Like, what is that? But they have indulged me, and they've all signed up for at the University of Texas at San Antonio, we have a relationship with a company called Territorium that has their own LER platform called Life Journey. My students have all signed up for it. I push their badges to this portfolio. They claim those badges. And then when we do this career day event in a couple of days a couple of weeks where I'll ask my executive MBA alumni to come back in and be kind of an external validation source for my students, those students will be able to push those badges to these quote unquote job interviewers, these EMBA alumni, and share with them, not just the badges that they've earned in my course, but also, their experiences, their lived experiences. And yeah. So that's kind of, I think, how this whole ecosystem fits together and where the portfolio sits within it. I think my intuition here is that this is important. Uh, this is an important platform for us to make sure our students are aware of.
Absolutely. And I'm hearing this thinking, oh, this is part of the answer. It's part of the mix that students need to engage in order to get that first job or that second job, that entry level job. You mentioned AI before, and I do want to tackle this question of how AI is changing how people are hired, especially, and what they can be doing, knowing that AI is wiping out that bottom rung and knowing that AI is changing the way that employers are searching for individuals. Can you speak to the importance of adapting with AI skills and adapting to those who are using AI skills to try and find them?
Yeah, yeah. Oh man, that's the question of the day, Ryan. And I think it's fair to say right now we I don't know that we have a full understanding of what AI is doing to the job market, right? I've seen reports that suggest that, AI is replacing the jobs, at the entry level. I've seen compelling arguments that, they're not so much replacing jobs in that, but they are, but companies, because they're making such huge investments in AI, don't have the resources to hire as many people as they used to. So that's an indirect way of saying that they're replacing jobs, I suppose. But AI, as kind of cool and wonderful as it is on some levels, you kind of put your queries into this into the system, right? When you pick your favorite Gen AI to do that, and so kind of this amazing output comes back. At least initially, I'll say. The initial response is like, oh my gosh, I put this query in, and I got this 2 paragraph response with 9 bullet points on what to do next and whatnot. Initially, when you get that back, it's kind of like, oh my goodness, this is an amazing product, right? There is also this concept of AI slop out there, right? And I'm sure you're aware of that. And likely this is probably user error on my part, but I've yet to put a query into Gen AI into a system and not have to do a substantial amount of work with whatever was produced. And I think that's where AI is powerful, right? And that's also a limitation of AI in its current instantiation. I believe that as an idea partner, it is an incredible tool. And so I bring it into my class. I'm not afraid of it. I mean, I'm a business professor. I teach in applied science, right? I don't see a student being able to use AI any different than a student being able to use Excel or build out a dashboard in Tableau. These are business skills that we have to teach our students. And so I don't run from it. I encourage it to be used in my course. I do warn my students that whatever you submit is your own work and will be graded as such. And so you better review it, and you better make sure that you believe in whatever it is you're submitting. And I need you to cite it as well. Those are my personal requirements in my course. Um, so going back to your question about like how is AI impacting the job market and what are the workarounds now, it's also important to share that this is a bidirectional issue, AI, right? So it's doing two things, at least from my research and my understanding. A job posting comes out. An individual has their resume in a document, uploads that resume to the favorite Gen AI along with the job posting and says, tailor my resume and a cover letter for this job posting. And Gen AI is really powerful to do in doing this because you're feeding it the material and it's just putting it in this kind of nice, kind of tight form. But you're one of thousands and thousands of individuals doing that exact same thing. So yes, and maybe initially for the first, month or two when this was happening, some folks were landing jobs because they were on the bleeding edge of using Gen AI. But now organizations are getting slammed with these tailored resumes. And so we're right back into the situation where we were before, which is on the employer side, which is what am I actually seeing? Like, how do I know what this potential employee can do? And so it's is a difficult job market for the employee, no doubt. It is also exceptionally difficult for the employer to understand what they're actually seeing in these applications and in the resumes that they're getting. And, we're in this world where it's all about economizing and building scale and being super efficient. But I think the answer, it's not going to be an attractive answer, but I think the answer is this. It's the face to face. It's the connecting. It's the building networks. It's that's why I'm encouraging my students to kind of finish off their session in my course with this career day event where they get to meet folks, they get to be in front of them. And I think it's really important for them to be physically in front of them. I love tech and I love Zoom and us being able to do this online is great, super powerful. But at the end of the day, sitting across a table from somebody, looking them in the eye and answering a question and being authentic about it, I think that's going to become increasingly valuable as a way for organizations to suss out who it is they're looking for. And so then the question becomes, all right, then how do we help our students get into that group of folks that get invited to the in-person interview? And I don't have an answer for that yet. I apologize, Ryan. I haven't figured it all out. But I do think where this is heading is far more kind of face-to-face interaction and networking, potentially a decentralization approach where people build a tight network in an area where they are living and whatnot through all of their connections, whether it's their prior employers, the university, their professors, their volunteer activities, whatever it is that they do. I think it's going to put a premium on these kind of face-to-face interactions. And I'm just going to point back to Exhibit A, which is communication. It's so important. You have to be able to do this, right? You have to be able to engage with somebody and pitch yourself.
You might be able to borrow from the work you've done in your storytelling series for this answer. The idea of pitching yourself quickly. We have competitions built around this. We have, pitch competitions where people are trying to make themselves as attractive as possible in as short a time as possible. And people who go to career day events like what you're organizing and the ones that UT San Antonio is organizing too through the Career Center. That's a great resource with lots and lots of resources that students can take advantage of, including getting in front of employers who happen to be coming to campus or who are scheduling them through these virtual interviews. So, what advice do you have in an AI world, right, for those who are trying to prepare themselves for that short, make an impression, get the job kind of situation?
Yeah. Yeah. So, obviously there's frameworks, right? There's storytelling frameworks, right? Everybody loves the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell's great, helping us understand that story arc. And so when I teach the storytelling frameworks in my course, right, it's about the story. It's about, having that compelling opening. But very quickly after that, it's about tight, making it really, really tight, right? Conciseness, clarity. And so part of this in an AI world in preparing your pitch is to follow these kind of frameworks that we know are tried and true, the storytelling frameworks. We're all storytellers and we all love hearing stories. And so leveraging those frameworks is super powerful. But I guess the other two components that I would add to that could really make a difference is the research on the front end. Who are you going to talk to? What is their perspective, right? How can you take your story and put it in a lens that they would consider interesting and exciting, right? And it might be different if you're talking to the CFO of an organization versus a hiring manager of an organization versus the marketing director of an organization, right? So your story is not generic. Your story has to be tailored to the individual you're talking to. And that only happens through research. And we've got wonderful resources like LinkedIn where we can understand who we're talking to when we go into these organizations. And there's another concept, and I'm baffled why we don't do more of this. And I have a manuscript I'm working on in this space, and it's all about this idea of practice. And we grew up, whether we're a musician or playing sports, or even our elementary school days, it's all about practice. Everything we do is practice. We practice and then we play the game. We practice and then we play in the concert. We practice and then we do the test. My sense is that when we become professionals, we just stop practicing. And I don't exactly know why. And so that second component beyond doing the research, so you know who you're talking to and you're tailoring your pitch to that, is standing in front of a mirror and just practicing. We love to watch Shark Tank and be like, oh, wow, this is so compelling. I don't even like this idea, but man, it's like such a compelling story, right? That individual didn't walk out on that stage and just come up with that spin in that moment, right? It's about practice. And so that's the other component that I would encourage anybody to engage in. You have to, I mean, yes, it's wonderful to be able to ad lib and spin your stories. And some folks are talented enough to be able to do that on the spot. But practice. It's just getting your pitch down and then practicing it and doing it in a way where it comes across as the authentic version of you.
I love that. The authentic version. It's perfect fit for something called the Storytelling Movement podcast to be talking about how the hero's journey can actually help you get a job because it's about communication at work. What other frameworks have you found most useful? I know STAR is popular, for example. What other frameworks do you teach to help students make that impression?
Yeah, the kind of the core concept, the core framework that I teach is SCCR, right? So setting, characters, conflict, resolution. And so that's the framework that I ask my students to kind of build their story around. And then I ask them to produce, I give them a series of like interview questions and they write it out and I say, okay, half as long, right? And they write it out again. I say, okay, half as long, right? Because I'm trying to get down to just the essential elements of the story, right? The setting. You don't have to spend 30 minutes going into the backstory. I don't need to know that it was a rainy day in Detroit when this idea came to your mind. Like that's too much detail. So and this is where the practice comes in. But yeah, the concept, the core framework that I use the most is this setting, characters, conflict resolution. And I layer on top of that this idea of Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey.
I love that. I know that sometimes when people are trying to ask employers questions, they fall into the trap you just described. It was a rainy day. Let me give you a whole bunch of detail you don't need to know, and then they ask their question. I'm wondering what advice you have for those kinds of interactions that they'll have beyond that setting character conflict resolution framework that you have, what other things do you ask students to do to connect with those employers on a deeper level? Because I know it's more than just, oh, we both like soccer, we both like basketball. You know what I mean? Like students often are trying to connect in such a short period of time, and the framework isn't the only thing they need to be doing. What else do they need to be doing?
Yeah, great question. So, we know from research on influence and persuasion that there are some basic things we can be doing to connect with individuals. There's Giardini out of Arizona. He's done some great work in this space, and we know that what we would call similarity and liking have this kind of way to make instant connections, right? And so, I'm going to put my students in front of these UTSA EMBA alumni. They already have something in common. They're all going to be alumni, partners, future Roadrunner, right? Alumni. So I've already given them the first component of similarity, right? But there's other kind of things that we can do to find the similarity in others, right? It can be anything from obviously from what school you went to the career that you're in, to what you might do as a volunteer, right? Activities you do outside. And so, as the conversation begins, right, there should be a little bit of this sussing out where you're getting to know this individual. And I'm just going to refer again to the importance of practice in this space, right? Our students, they have a lot of experience, and I'm doing the best I can to bring that to the forefront. But, having the opportunity to connect with a potential employer, or at the very least a new networking connection through this career day event, they're going to have to figure out, you know, ways to engage in conversation. And it has to be more than, oh, it was hot today, wasn't it? Right. We have to get outside of the weather conversation. It can be a current event, so that's one thing, right? So leveraging what we know works in the persuasion and influence space on the similarity and liking component. And then the other component is just being curious and being observant, right? So there are all kinds of these actions that individuals take that kind of tip their hand as to whether they're bored, as to whether they're still paying attention. The obvious is, when I'm teaching and clearly I'm talking too much and someone yawns, right? I'm like, okay, Rudy, pick it up, going too slow, right? You're losing the crowd. But you can just watch the behavior, right? And again, this is where our students will have to get experience in this. But if you're having a conversation and somebody sits back, and puts their arms across, right? I mean, that is a signal to you that maybe they're getting a little closed off. Maybe they don't agree with what you're saying, right? The shifting of in the seat, right? Are they mimicking what you're doing, right? Maybe you had a runny nose that day and you're just like rubbing your nose and then you notice that the person's rubbing their nose. And so it's becoming observant of the situation and looking for those cues in real time to adjust the story. And so I like to think that all the information is out there. It's just whether or not our radar is tuned in to pick that stuff up. And so I think a lot of our jobs are to help our students, maybe kind of fine tune that radar.
You mentioned Cialdini and obviously teaching persuasion, huge fan. One of his other things that he identified was social proof. And I'm thinking about the importance of things like LinkedIn and these social networks in addition to these networking opportunities. Can you speak to the effective practices that one might leverage in crafting their own LinkedIn presence and networking with other individuals?
Interesting. Okay. So from a social proof perspective, you're basically tell me a little bit more how you're kind of connecting that to LinkedIn.
Yeah, so I'm thinking LinkedIn has not only those badges that you're providing proudly displayed on their certifications, but they also have proof of thinking, of thought leadership. This is an opportunity for students to say, this is how I think about management strategy. This is what I've learned at UT San Antonio from my professors, and posting about it over time to create that consistency and that communication that then signals, oh, this is someone who not only has social proof from their network or from what they say, but also the certification. So I see LinkedIn as an important part of setting yourself apart much more than it used to be, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's okay. So I think I understand where you're going with the social proof question. So yeah, it's another avenue, right, to demonstrate, learned experiences. LinkedIn, I agree 100% with you, Ryan. It's a super powerful platform. I think to a large extent, what we're doing in my course is, and they can certainly add their badges to LinkedIn, but we're also asking them to keep it on their learning and employment record, which they can then put on LinkedIn as a link, right? Access my learning and employment record. You can see my life journey account, right? And so, this all acts and works towards the social proof component, which is, you know, this is this is me going out, living these experiences, sharing them, right? The only question that I would have in that space, if it was purely LinkedIn, so LinkedIn is, and I apologize. I mean, I certainly like LinkedIn. I'm not a super LinkedIn user, but my recollection is that I remember like I went to my account and they're like, you have a new validation. And I was like, that's funny. I haven't actually logged into LinkedIn in like a month. And so I logged in and it was like, so and so says you're a great presenter. And I was like, oh, this is a person on my network. I guess, they were an, EMBA student of mine and they felt I was a good, facilitator and, ran a good class. And so they gave me this validation. And I appreciated it. It was a nice compliment, and I guess on some level that's social proof that I'm, you know, good in the classroom. At least this one individual thought so. But there lacks a validation component to that. And that's why I like the learning and employment record a little bit more. It still allows folks to put their uh, self-identified or self-verified credentials on there, but it also allows them to include validated credentials from a place like UTSA or from Coursera. I think that from a social proof perspective, that carries more weight than somebody saying, "Yeah, Bruce is a good presenter." And so, but since we're on Cialdini, I will add that there's another one of his other persuasion characteristics, right, which is commitment. And so when my students go into the career day here in a couple of weeks, what I'm teaching them about is this idea of commitment, right? And getting commitment to be verbal, right? Because we know that as individuals, if we commit to doing something, we don't like to turn back on our word, right? That was the big finding here. And so, what I'm priming my students to do as they end their interview with these EMBA alumni is to see if they can extract a commitment from them, right? I would love to, fill in the blank, reconnect with you in 2 weeks and share with you, right? Whatever we just talked about. Is that something that would be okay, right? And all you need is if you can get to yes, right? If you can get them to say, sure, yeah, let me give you my email address, right? Um, and so, yeah, so you and I can gab on persuasion and influence. I'm thinking probably for days. These are really powerful tools, and so I think we can help our students in a lot of ways by just helping them understand that these are tools that can be used to make your interaction with individuals more memorable.
We've been talking about proof and different ways that students can prove they have what it takes to get employed or to get the job or to get the interview. Whenever you're looking at alternative pathways for proof, what comes to mind? Because we think of proof projects as real world projects, but sometimes you can't get that internship. So you have to take matters in your own hands. So, how can students maybe pitch local organizations or nonprofits to create that proof portfolio or that proof project that helps to distinguish them in that career day interview or that alumni interview?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. I think there's two questions in there, which is at the university level, what is our job on providing opportunities for that proof? So that's one question. And then from the student's perspective, what is their responsibility to go out and mine opportunities to create that proof? So if we consider the first question, at the university level, I fundamentally believe we can be doing more. It's one thing for me to walk into my classroom with my students and say, "You guys have all these lived experiences. We're going to spend a big chunk of this semester figuring out how to assess this tacit knowledge and build your story." That's great. They have 22 to 24 years of experience when they enter my classroom. They have lived experience. But at the university level, I believe we can be doing more, right? Whether that is creating, work study opportunities, whether that is partnering with organizations in the community to create those worked experiences. It's hard to get organizations to pay, right? I mean, the economy's tight. It's tough, right? So why don't we as a university give the student credit for that instead, right? So it's a different form of currency, right? The company is hopefully getting a good, which is a free worker to work on a project of some sort, and the worker is getting a good, right? The student's getting a good, which is that experience. And so whether it's, partnering with organizations in and around our community, whether it's building out opportunities within the university, right? Going out and getting dollars from wealthy alumni to build centers to actually give our students real world experience, right? We have to be doing a better job. We have a new partnership with UT Health San Antonio, right? We are now the same organization, healthcare, and a really important industry, right? What kind of opportunities can we mine at UT Health to generate opportunities for our students to get that experience? And maybe instead of them getting paid for this, they're getting, 3 hours of semester credit and the ability to demonstrate this lived experience that they can then find the job with. So that's question A, right? How can we at the university level and really any educational institution build experience and learning into the curriculum? The second question, how can students mine this? How can they go out and find this? And frankly, that's what's going to need to happen in the near term. We're going to have to continue to encourage our students to do that because at the university level, I don't think we're a big school. It'd be difficult to scale this idea that I just shared with you across all of our undergrads, which is why you pilot it. You do the things that I'm doing in my class. You see what sticks and what doesn't, what works. You evaluate, you make adjustments, you move forward. And so, what can students be doing? Well, any experience is good experience, right? And so, we like to, at least in my class, I'll say, how many folks here have jobs set up when they're graduating? And a decent number will raise their hands. But yet I've done this survey and I know only 37% have actual jobs lined up. And it turns out that most everybody's worked or is currently working their way through school. And so, this isn't though necessarily the jobs that they want when they graduate. This is what we would call underemployment, right? They are working in jobs, the kind of the traditional jobs that you start out in, right? Servers at a restaurant, so for example, and they're doing this because it pays their bills and it gets them some spending money, but you don't really need a college degree to do this job. And so they're underemployed if they stay in this job. But I can guarantee you that in that job, they've developed skills that are incredibly powerful, right? If you're a server, let's stick with that example. If you're a server and you have to deal with an unruly group, at a table, right? And you can maneuver through that conversation and get them what they need and provide them whatever service your job requires you to provide them, move them out, you've learned an important skill. And so these skills and these experiences and mining of those, we just have to look deeper at what we've done and not treat this job that we had as teenagers, that we may currently have, as something other than truly what it is, which is experience. So that's another area I think where you know our students can be more proactive. And again, not to beat a dead horse here, but that's what I'm trying to do in my classes is helping them see that just because they don't have the job at the Fortune 500 company that they thought they were going to have when they graduated from college, it doesn't mean they don't have experience. It doesn't mean that they don't know these skills. We just have to help them see that.
Absolutely. And if they've applied all the things that we've discussed and they've built their proof project portfolios, and in my classes, we have a integrated marketing communication portfolio in almost all of our situations where they're working with the nonprofit to create something. Let's say they've done all the things right and they're at the point of salary negotiation. I'm sure you have advice for what to say, what not to say, and how to approach that from your persuasive expertise and negotiation expertise.
Gosh. So I'm not a negotiations professor. I know just enough to be dangerous in this space. And I think, there's no universal kind of advice here. I think this is where you have to kind of play the game and understand what your needs are at the individual level. Do you have a job set up? Is this a second job you're going for? Potentially that allows you to be more aggressive. Negotiations theory would say that you throw out a salary number that's higher than what you think you deserve because we want to anchor around that number, and then all the negotiations happen around that number. But if you are unemployed and need a job, right, then how aggressive are you with that anchoring number? How high do you go? right? So we do our research, we understand what the salary ranges are for these types of jobs, take a look at our backgrounds and think really critically about what it is that we bring to the table. Look at the job opportunity and understand, is this something that is a stepping stone to something bigger, or is it just a paycheck? Right? I think you have to factor in all of these different components when you go in to the job interview and ultimately the salary negotiation, so that when you're throwing out that number, if you're being asked to throw out that number, oftentimes, organizations at this level will say, "This is what you're getting paid." Right? And you say, "Well, thank you very much." That doesn't mean you can't go back and maybe try to push it a little bit, but it really depends on each individual's situation and how hard they want to push. How badly do they need this experience? How badly do they need this job? And I would never tell anybody to not value their skills, but oftentimes we have to get into the job to really demonstrate our skills and to demonstrate our value. And so we don't want to anchor on a number that's going to cause the employer to walk away from us. And we want to, maybe be at the higher end of that range if we're feeling good about ourselves, if we have other opportunities. But again, I think, it's not universal advice. It's more of advice around, and hopefully align with what I've been talking, with you a lot about today, which is understand your story, understand your pitch, do the research on who you're going to talk to, understand their situation, understand the job position, practice, right? And as part of that, all of this, the ultimate salary negotiation, you do everything else we just described. The salary negotiation tends to take care of itself, right? Because if you've pitched yourself well, if you've been able to demonstrate the skills that you have in a real world scenarios to the job market, to the employer, hiring manager, whomever, you are able then to, potentially make a stronger argument for, potentially a better salary. But at the end of the day, for our students who are really just trying to break into the market, I think you have to, yeah, you want to be cautious here. And you want to make sure that you don't scare off the employer.
Absolutely. Resources. What are the resources students who do not have the honor of having Dr. Bruce Rudy as their professor, or me, I'll say, I'm not so bad myself, who don't have the honor of having us as a professor, what resources should they be seeking other than those resources that we see at the UT San Antonio Career Center? Because they have a whole list and a whole page of wonderful resources, but I know there's more out there.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I mean, yeah. So you don't have to be in my course to build your own learning and employment record. Again, this is your experience that you're living. So looking at the Territorium product that we use at UTSA, there's a product called Smart Resume. There's a lot of LERs out there that you can create yourself. You don't need to be sitting in my class to do that. That's part of my course. And so I would argue that, starting to look at those types of resources, how do I go about building out my own LER, my own personal digital resume? But then you have to ask, okay, well then how do I populate it? Well, so for my course, right, I've seeded these 4 badges into it, right? So I've helped the students begin to populate their digital resume, their LER. How do you do that if you're not sitting in my class? Well, so you mentioned it already, Ryan, right? There's other validation. There's other credential givers out there, right? Coursera, who the University of Texas has a partnership with, offers tons of credentials. It doesn't have to be leadership and power skill credentials, soft skill credentials that I teach. It can be these technical credentials. It's also entirely possible for for folks to go back to their professors, right, or to their employers and say, "Hey, I have this digital resume, this learning and employment record. I've been working for you for the last 2 years. I've been promoted twice. That in and of itself says something, but could you build out a credential for me?" Right? And the employer is going to say, "What? Like, that's ridiculous. Like, why would I do that? Like, I pay you to do your job. Now you're telling me I need to build a credential." And so I would encourage our students, or any student, to say, "No, no, no, no. I'm not asking you to build a credential. Let me put together what I believe is the components of the competency or the credential that I've earned by working in this job." Right? I've dealt with, multiple angry customers, but they're still customers, which means I'm good at having difficult conversations. I've built out an inventory system that allows us to track in a more dynamic way raw materials coming in. I would ask our students any student to think critically about what it is, what those skills are, and then potentially develop what the badge could be, and then go to the employer and say, I believe this is what I've done. Is this something you'd be willing to validate for me? And then they could create a little badge for that company. And this behooves the company as well, because then the company's all of a sudden, that's free marketing for the company. I employed Bruce. He got all these skills over 2 years. So wow, look at this. I'm now an employer that other individuals want to come to. So again, this doesn't have to be just what's good for the employee. This can also be what's good for the employer. And I won't even get into the conversation around the learning organization, but which is like foundational in management. But we know healthy organizations are always learning and always evolving and always innovating. And this is another way, at least on the HR side, to begin to sell the company to future great employees.
In the pricing of those, the student then would be paying for those, right? The LERs?
It's free to students.
Okay, so after they've graduated, then they would be paying? Like, how is that? I assume someone has to pay something for the maintenance of the portfolio. Is that not true? Is that how it works?
So the university with Life Journey, that's the relationship that pays. And so once you have a Life Journey account, it's your account. You don't have to pay for it beyond that. Speaking a little bit of school from some of the other providers, but I believe there are a number of providers of LERs where they allow the potential employee to come in and do this for free, right? Create that credential, or create the digital resume, the LER, and then they look at for organizations to fund it, right? And so in our situation, it's the University of Texas system that funds the relationship with the LE with Territorium. The individual student doesn't have to pay anything even after they graduate. It's Life Journey is that is their digital set of credentials. It's a digital wallet. But my understanding is that they're, whether it's Smart Resume, which is another kind of big player in this space, at the individual level, you can go out and create your Smart Resume. Um, you know, how that gets maintained and managed is for an employer then to go into the Smart Resume database and pull out the individual with the best fit. Well, that costs the organization, right? But the promise to the organization is you're getting a much higher quality individual or a group of individuals that you can then interview. So that's the value proposition.
That makes sense. We've talked about building value, building proof, practice. If you could leave our audience with one piece of advice, the most important thing they need to keep in mind after they've logged off here, what would that be?
One piece of advice is for our audience, which I'm assuming is going to be folks that are interested in doing well in the job market, potentially landing their first job or improving their their position in their current job. I would go back to what Michael Polanyi says. You know more than you can tell. You have all of this tacit knowledge. We all do. Just getting to this point in our lives, whatever point we each of us are in at this individual level, we have all of this lived experience. I think there is a tremendous opportunity for us to reflect on that as individuals, to mine all of the experiences that we've had and everything we've learned along the way that's tied to the tacit knowledge, not necessarily the explicit knowledge of what we learned because we took Bruce's strategy course. I would just encourage folks to remember that you're not this blank sheet of paper that the organization that you work for defines. You actually come in with all this experience and just to reflect on what you do and reflect on what you've accomplished in your experiences and then determine how best to potentially validate that and then sell that or pitch that to future employers. That's what my piece of advice would be.
Excellent. And where can we find Dr. Bruce Rudy online?
You can definitely find me on LinkedIn. Although I did, if you watch this whole thing, you'll know that I'm not checking that every day. But you're always welcome to connect with me. Anybody that watches this and is interested, please reach out to me, connect with me on LinkedIn. And I'm a teacher, so I love hearing from anybody interested in the stuff that I'm talking about. Bruce.rudy@utsa.edu. That's my email address. You're also welcome to send me emails with questions, and I'll do my best to respond and help anybody out.
Dr. Bruce Rudy, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience and expertise about the business of expertise, right? That you're sharing your expertise on how people can build expertise in a tough labor market. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Ryan. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the time today.